All right, just one matter that I need to get on the record first. I had indicated to counsel yesterday that juror number 12, Mr. Ludwig, that his wife had gone to the hospital yesterday. And when he left yesterday, he found out that they were going to keep her for surgery. So Mr. Ludwig had gotten in contact with Ms. Harper to explain all of that to her last night. So I indicated to Ms. Harper to notify Mr. Ludwig that I would excuse him. I'm not going to reshuffle the jurors, but this now means that Mitchell will be juror number 12. Okay. All right. Anything on behalf of the state first that we need to get on the record?
No, Your Honor. Other than to say the state agrees with the court decision to excuse juror number 12 and has no objection whatsoever.
All right. On behalf of the defendant?
The same here, Your Honor. We have no objection to, under the circumstances of juror number 12 being excused in place.
Okay. And there's nothing else that needs to be placed on the record? All right. Ms. Harper. All rise for the jury. All right, maybe seated, ladies and gentlemen. All right, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
All right, welcome back again to courtroom 4B. At this time, we will continue with the cross-examination of Detective Howe. Detective, you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
All right. Mr. Thomas, you may inquire.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. I'm here. Detective Howe, thank you for your testimony. Judge, I have some questions.
Okay, all right. Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Detective Howe, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions for some clarification, okay?
Yes.
On Safety Exhibit T5, you were given all of the Google geolocation records, correct?
Yes.
And you turned those over?
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Thomas had asked you about if you had mapped all of the geolocation hits. And the question I have for you is, when you looked through the data, did any of those geolocation hits, were any of them inconsistent with what you mapped? Meaning, for example, did you see a hit that was on the other side of town in addition to the ones that were within the incident location?
No, the only ones that were even close to something like that were the ones where I showed the differences in the maps between the two locations of where the actual hit was and where that location was that was in the timeline.
Okay. And Mr. Thomas also asked you some questions about the extraction report and in your training and experience, how long can these reports be if you were to look through all of it?
Several thousand pages, especially on iPhones, and well, actually any phone that holds a lot of data like that.
So if you have a message hoarder like me that never deletes any of their text messages, you could be there for a while.
Yes, the most text messages I've ever seen is like 22,000 on a phone. So the report, if we were to generate that, it would be very lengthy. So we try to narrow what we're giving and looking at.
And just to clear something up, was a geolocation report possible for Rachel's iPhone?
Not on the data that I looked at. I didn't believe it was possible because it was an iPhone and there was a Yahoo account attached to it with that Apple ID that was assigned to the phone.
Okay.
The likelihood of having any data was very slim.
Your Honor, if I may have the promo briefly.
You may.
From your report from State's Exhibit T4, I might want to turn it on. That'd be helpful.
triangle? There you
I was
go.
just trying to take off all those yellow marks.
Yep, clear.
There we go. Detective Howe, on page 18 of T4, Mr. Thomas was asking you some questions about what the 21 meters, for example, was in the display radius.
Yes.
Can you explain to us that display radius? Does that mean that the phone and the person with the phone could be anywhere within that radius, or is that they are right in the middle?
Based on that information, it would be anywhere in that area of that display radius.
So at the time, the phone and the person could be anywhere within these 35 hits.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. And then finally, you had talked a little bit about having Detective Hughes go out to the front of Rachel's door. What exactly did you ask him to do?
I asked him if he could give me the location, the coordinates for that exact spot, so that way everything would be more accurate.
You say coordinates. What exactly do you mean?
The latitude and longitude of where he was standing.
Why is that helpful to you for your report?
Because it's going to be latitude and longitude, which is a specific place on Earth, and rather than just a mailing address.
And then, did you then take that latitude and longitude and apply it to your report?
Yes.
If I may have one moment, Your Honor.
You may.
Detective, did you explain to Detective Hughes how to get that latitude and longitude?
Yes.
Did he know?
He did not.
Okay. And going back, I won't publish it again, but that page 18 with all of the circles, could you give us some reasons as to hypothetically why some of them are smaller and some of them are bigger?
Those are just different hits with different, they can be different sources. The bigger the radius for the meters that you see could just be a not great signal, a worse signal than what you would have with, like, say, the 21 meter. I would consider the 21 meters very precise, whereas I think we looked at one yesterday that was 300 meters, which is a very large area.
And some of the things we had talked about with the hits, could the environment be part of that? Like, say, if you're in a building or if you're in the upstairs of the building versus the bottom?
Yes.
Could you explain how that would work?
Like, say you're in an apartment building that is brick, your signal is obviously going to be not as strong as if you were standing outside where the satellites could, if you're talking GPS, the satellites could see you, or you can see around in your area for those Wi-Fi hits that we saw.
Okay. And so even if you're upstairs versus downstairs, could that affect how accurate the hit is?
Yes, it's all going to be based on the signal that your phone receives from whatever the source is.
Okay. Thank you, Detective Howe.
Thank you, Ms. Van Coover. Recross?
Thank you very much. So that I'm clear and the members of jury are clear, did you try to do a geolocation on Rachael Anderson's phone?
No.
And were you looking for any information that would exclude Anthony Pardon as being a suspect in this case?
Such as?
That's my question. Did you do anything?
Well, I wasn't the investigator. I was just analyzing the data, so I didn't, other than look at the records that I received from his device.
The type of phone you have could affect the ability to receive Wi-Fi or GPS tracking?
Yes.
So in that case, what kind of phone did Detective Hughes use or have when you were conducting the longitude, latitude, location, what kind of phone did he have?
He has an iPhone.
He had an iPhone.
Yes.
And when you were explaining certain things to Detective Hughes, was it in your mind, was your doing this extraction, was that to tie the credit card use to the homicide? Was that part of why you were doing this? Was that your major emphasis in this case?
I was trying to show where the device was between a certain time period, from the time prior to the homicide until the last event on its timeline.
So it wasn't your objective, your end result, to tie the credit card use to the homicide?
No.
Thank you, Detective Howe. Detective Howe, I'm sorry. Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. All right, Detective Howe, you can step down, sir. You're not to discuss your testimony with anyone while this case is still pending. State may call their next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state would call Lynndsey.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as you shall answer unto God under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
You may be seated. Look, it's important that you speak up loud enough so that the ladies and gentlemen of the jury can hear you. Okay, for the record, you would state your name, spelling your last.
It is Lynndsey, Lynndsey, Simon, Simon.
Thank you. You may inquire.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
You and I are fast talkers, and I drank a lot of coffee this morning, so we're going to have to be very slow for Carla, okay?
Okay.
Would you please let the jurors know where you work?
I work at the Columbus Police Crime Laboratory.
What do you do for them?
I'm a forensic scientist.
As a forensic scientist, do you have a specific assignment or specialty?
I do.
What is that?
I perform DNA analysis.
How long have you worked at the crime lab?
Approximately 6.5 years.
Do you have any specialized education or training to do that job?
Yes, I do.
Can you walk us through that, please?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Forensic Science and Biology, and also a Master of Science in Forensic Biology.
Is the Columbus Police Lab the first place that you've worked?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And when did you start there?
I started in August of 2013.
And have you done DNA analysis for the lab since that time?
Since 2015, I have.
Do you have any kind of continuing education requirements?
Yes, we do.
Are you current on those?
Yes,
Does the lab do what we call proficiency testing?
they do.
Can you explain what proficiency testing is for the jury?
We are required to perform 2 proficiency tests per calendar year, and that is just a test that's provided by an outside agency that we perform DNA analysis on and send the results in.
You've been passing those?
Yes.
Just checking. Do you have any kind of peer review within the lab?
Yes, we do.
Can you explain that for us?
Each of our reports undergo a technical review by another qualified analyst and also an administrative review to check for grammatical errors and spelling.
You sped up there a little bit. Is the lab accredited?
Yes, it is.
Can you explain to the jury what it means for the Columbus Police Crime Lab to be accredited?
So it means that an outside agency has come into our laboratory and reviewed our manuals and procedures to make sure that we are following the standards set forth by that accrediting body.
Is every crime lab in the United States accredited?
As far as I know, I'm not quite sure if everyone is, but I know that we are.
Okay, all right. And about how many DNA tests do you think you've run during your career?
I've written approximately 1,400 DNA reports.
Have you ever had to testify in court before?
Yes.
How many times?
It's about 20 times.
Okay. Were you qualified as an expert those times?
Yes.
Has it all been in Franklin County?
Most of it has been.
Where else have you testified?
Federal court.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I would ask that Ms. Simon be qualified as an expert in DNA analysis.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
The record shall so reflect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you explain for the jury what happened? So we've heard about evidence being collected and turned into the lab.
Yes.
Can you explain to them what's the first thing that happens if something is being sent to you for DNA testing?
So the first thing would be that we receive a request for laboratory examination for DNA analysis, and that request will have a list of all the evidence items that they want DNA analysis performed.
And who would submit that?
It would be an officer
A detective?
or a detective.
Do you, through the course of your testing, communicate with the submitting detective?
Yes.
Would you ever suggest additional items to be tested or tell them the value of not testing certain items?
That can happen, yes.
So once that request has been made, let's say you have a piece of evidence now and you're going to conduct DNA testing on it. What's the next thing that happens?
So the next thing would be that we would request that evidence be brought to our laboratory so we could test it. And the first step of the testing would be a screening or serology process.
What happens in that process?
So we will examine the item for presence of a biological material. That can be either blood or semen. And we will also, if necessary, collect what we call trace or touch DNA swabs from that item.
Let's talk a little bit about touch DNA. Is that something that has, I don't know the right way to say it, but a more recent development in the world of DNA?
Yes.
About how long has touch DNA been something that you guys have had sensitive enough equipment to test for?
Probably the past few years.
Can you just tell us what is touch DNA?
Touch DNA can be anything that potentially was left behind by a contributor. It could be something that was handled by a person of interest, or it could be clothing that they were wearing and left behind at the scene.
Are we going to leave touch DNA on everything we touch or everything we wear?
Not necessarily.
What might impact the ability to leave touch DNA?
It could be the length of time that the individual handled the item. It could also be environmental conditions could have an impact on the quality of the DNA that's left behind.
Does each person have the same ability to leave the same amount of touch DNA?
No.
Explain that to us a little bit, please.
Some people just naturally shed more DNA than others, so those people would be more likely to leave DNA behind.
You would call people that leave more DNA shedders?
Yes.
That's gross, Lynndsey. Is that that's what you would call it?
That's the term for it, yes.
And then you mentioned something about there might be environmental things.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Could be heat. If something's left out in the heat, that could degrade the DNA that would have been on that item. If it was raining, that could wash away any potential evidence that was left behind on an item.
Could wiping off an object impact DNA?
Yes.
How about the length of time? So for example, let's say I touch this podium and I don't touch it again for a year and it gets swabbed. Would that impact the ability to get my DNA off of here?
Potentially, yes.
And we're going to talk a little bit later about what quantity and quality means, but is that one of the things that might impact?
Yes.
Okay, so you might see a little bit of my DNA, but it might be really bad.
Possibly.
That's not a science term, right? Okay, we'll come back to touch DNA, but you do this initial screening and you're looking for the possibility of blood, semen, and then if there's any kind of touch DNA you mentioned.
Yes.
Okay, and then what's the next step after you do that screening?
So if we do find potential blood or semen evidence on an item, or if we do take swabs for touch DNA, those will be sent forward through the entire DNA process. So there's 4 different stages that we typically have for the DNA process itself.
You know I'm going to ask you, what are those stages?
Yep. So the first stage is what we call extraction. So you're breaking open the cells to release the DNA into solution. So the next stage is what we call quantitation, and we want to determine how much DNA we have in the sample. And at that point, we can determine what further processes we want to kind of move forward with that sample. After that, there's an amplification stage where we make copies of specific regions of the DNA that we want to look at. And then once we have those fragments, we separate them out on an instrument in order to generate what we call a DNA profile.
Okay. I want to talk about each of those steps just a little bit. Extraction, first of all. So you have this item that's been submitted, okay? So for example, let's say that you're going to test my jacket. Mm-hmm. Are you taking my jacket itself and extracting the DNA from it, or are you doing something to my jacket?
I would be collecting swabs of potential touch DNA from the jacket.
Can you see touch DNA?
No.
So how do you know you're swabbing the right area?
We try and use the relevant case information to target those areas where we would potentially find that person of interest on that item.
Okay. So you take the swab.
Yes.
And then you do the extraction.
Yes.
Quantitation. I think you mentioned you want to see how much there is.
Yes.
Why does how much DNA you're able to get off of an item matter to you?
It matters in a couple different ways. The quantity is really important because if we don't have that quantity, then we're not going to be able to get a profile that we can interpret at the end. So we know what quantity we're trying to target in order to get what we call an interpretable DNA profile. It also is helpful because with the quantitation that we do, we can determine how much total human DNA is in the sample, but also how much male DNA is present in the sample.
Why does that matter?
That can be really helpful for sexual assault type evidence because you're typically going to have a lot of female DNA in the samples, and it's helpful to kind of target in and see if that sample has any male DNA present.
We'll come back to that.
Yes.
The next step you mentioned was amplification. You're making copies then?
Yes.
Are you changing the DNA or modifying it in any way when you amplify or make copies of the DNA?
No.
Okay. And then the last step was qualitative, right?
It would be the separation, yes.
Separation. I apologize. Why does that matter to you?
Because at this stage, we can separate out those fragments based on their size. So the instrument that we use does it based on an electric current. So smaller fragments will travel faster than larger fragments. And at the end, that instrument can generate what we call the DNA profile.
So let's talk a little bit about a DNA profile. What exactly are you looking for when you're interpreting or looking at that generated DNA profile?
We're looking for the quality and the quantity. So if there is enough information present to interpret it, but also how many contributors are potentially in that profile.
But even backing up from that, when I was talking to the jurors in voir dire, we talked about I'm dancing now, the Jurassic Park video, right? Like, what is DNA? What is it that what is the DNA, or what parts of the DNA are you looking at to interpret?
There are 23 specific regions of the DNA that we target for forensic purposes.
And that's on anything?
Yes.
And those 23 spots, are those things that you guys decided arbitrarily? Is there a scientific basis for that?
Those are all regions that are targeted for, because they're different between individuals, so they're better for identity.
That was my next question then. So will those 23 spots on me look different than Ms. Van Keulen's 23 spots?
Yes.
So they're unique to each one of us?
Yes.
Unless?
They're identical twins.
Okay. And taking us back to high school biology, where do I get each half of those 23 spots?
You get half from your mother and half from your father.
And would my 23 spots, my identifying numbers at those 23 spots, ever change during my lifetime?
No.
If you took a swab of my mouth and ran it through these 4 steps, what would that tell you?
I would have what we call a reference profile from the individual.
So my known DNA.
Yes.
So presumably, if you swab my mouth right, you get all those 23 spots.
Yes.
When you test evidence, do you always have information at all of those spots, at 23 spots?
No.
Why not?
It depends on the quality of the DNA. If it's degraded, we might lose some information at certain locations.
Now, you talked about that a little bit with touch DNA. Would that also apply to other pieces of evidence? Let's say you found semen or blood or something like that. Are you always going to get all 23?
Not necessarily.
Where are the best places to try to get somebody's DNA off of a piece of evidence?
Definitely, if you have that information about where they would have potentially touched it, that would be a great place to start. If you're talking about like clothing that you want to try to get who was wearing the clothing, you could try along the neckline or under the armpits where somebody might have sweat and left DNA behind.
Okay. How about bodily fluids?
Those usually are great sources of DNA, so you definitely would want to target those areas as well.
What are some of the best bodily fluids for DNA testing?
Could be blood, semen, and saliva.
Okay. But even in those situations, let's say you had something with blood, semen, or saliva, you may not get a full profile on a piece of evidence.
That's correct.
Depends on lots of things.
Yes.
The kinds of things that you told us might impact touch DNA?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. When you're going through those 4 steps you told us, extraction, quantitation, I stumble on that one sometimes, amplification and separation, are there ever steps, or do any of those steps, sorry Carla, tell you whether or not further testing will be helpful?
Yes.
Can you explain that for us, please?
So when we get through extraction and end up at that quantitation stage, we can look and see how much DNA we have, and we know that amount that we need to reach in order to get an interpretable profile. So if we're below that, then that will be the end of the process for that particular sample. Or if we're looking for male DNA, because we know that there's a male, potentially a male person of interest, then we will look and see if there's male DNA present in the sample. And if there isn't, then there would be no reason to continue forward.
Okay, so there's different things that it can tell you with regard to whether or not moving forward is going to be beneficial.
Yes.
You mentioned something about the amount of DNA. Who sets those standards for what you consider to be enough DNA to interpret?
We've done internal validations at our laboratory to determine that amount.
You're going to have to explain internal validations to us.
So before we run any kind of process or put anything in our lab manuals to actually perform DNA analysis, we go through what we call a validation process. So we make sure that it is running efficiently at our laboratory. We use mock casework type samples and make sure that what the data that we're seeing makes sense before we actually use it for real casework samples.
Do you also take any steps during the testing to make sure that you're not contaminating things, or that pieces of evidence or swabs from the evidence are not contaminating each other?
Yes.
What can you explain those for us?
During that screening or serology phase, we wear gloves, lab coats, face masks, and in between each evidence item, we will change our gloves. We will put down what we call bench paper, and we will change that between each evidence item as well. We use a bleach and ethanol solution in order to clean our utensils and lab spaces as well.
And do you ever run samples or tests, I should say, periodically to make sure the machines are working properly and that there's no contamination there? Yes.
During the extraction stage, we will run what we call a blank that has all of the same chemicals in it, just no DNA in that sample to make sure that the process is clean. And we will also run controls, especially at the amplification stage, a positive and a negative, just to make sure that we're getting the correct profile.
Okay, so let's say that you've gone through the 4 steps, you swabbed my jacket, you've gone through the 4 steps and you have enough DNA, you think, and you've got my swab from my mouth. Does the swab from my mouth go through those 4 steps too?
Yes.
Okay, so do you have, in my head, a machine spits out information for both. Do you compare them?
If the profile of the evidence is interpretable, then we will do comparisons.
Okay, so let's say that the swab from my jacket is interpretable. Now what are you gonna do? And you've got the swab from my mouth.
Then we will compare the profile from the evidence item to the profile from the reference standard.
Okay, and let's say that at the 23 spots, or whatever number is, your lab has decided is enough for an interpretable profile, you see my DNA. Do you have a screen that lights up and says match, match, match?
No.
Can you explain that for us, please?
We will do the comparison, and if there is enough present that we can say that they are included, we'll just call that an inclusion to the profile.
Does your lab ever use the term match or identified as somebody's DNA?
No.
If you were going to say that it was my DNA on the swab from my jacket, what would the general language be?
That you could not be excluded as a contributor to the profile.
Okay, would that mean that it's not my DNA?
No.
Okay. So is there an additional test? You mentioned something when you were talking about when you have a lot of female DNA. Is there another kind of testing that you can do when you have a swab that has a lot of female DNA?
Yes.
Can you explain that for us, please?
We have another type of test that is more targeted towards males, and it uses the Y chromosome. So we call it YSTR testing, and that would just target the male-specific DNA.
Again, back to high school biology. Girls are XX,
Yes.
boys are XY.
Yes.
I got it right. Okay. And so if I understand it, you're not looking at the 23 spots anymore. You're only looking at the Y chromosome.
Yes.
And why can that be helpful in certain cases? I think you mentioned a sexual assault.
Yes, because a lot of the sexual assault samples are from the victim's body, so they're going to have a lot of her DNA present. But we're not interested in her, we're looking for foreign DNA, so potentially a male profile. And sometimes there's just too much of the female DNA, and you're not able to separate that out from the sample. So YSTRs are an alternative method to targeting any male DNA that would be present.
So if I hear you right, the female DNA can be noisy.
Yes,
Not females, the female DNA can be noisy.
potentially.
In that, so if you're swabbing, for example, let's say that I had reported a sexual assault in my mouth, and you swab my mouth, and you have a positive male DNA. Is the YSTR getting rid of my DNA?
It's not getting rid of it, it's just ignoring it.
Okay, thank you for correcting me. So it doesn't eliminate it, it just removes it from your analysis.
Yes,
Quiets the noise.
basically, yes.
Okay. And would that include, you said a sexual assault, would it include any place on the female body?
Potentially, yes.
And can you explain why when you swab, this might sound like a silly question, but when you're swabbing the female body, whether it's on the inside or just even my skin, why would there be so much female noise or female DNA?
Because there could be picking up her skin cells. If you're swabbing outside her body, if you're swabbing the inside, you're potentially picking up epithelial cells from potentially her vaginal area as well.
What are epithelial cells?
Just cells that line the inside of the vagina.
Okay. Skin cells?
Potentially, yes.
Okay. I think we're ready to move on to this case.
Okay.
Okay. Were you asked to examine evidence for this case?
Yes, I was.
And as a result of that, did you prepare some reports?
Yes, I did.
Did you prepare them at or near the time of your testing?
Yes, I did.
And does the lab keep them as part of their normal course of business?
Yes, they do.
Do you have a duty to report information in them accurately?
Yes.
And did the information that you put in these labs, we're going to go through it all, but did it go through the processes, whether it's the 4-step process or the YSTR testing, did it go through those testing processes that you just explained for the jury?
Yes, they did.
And did you follow all the steps to make sure nothing was contaminated throughout this entire case?
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm going to hand you, we'll do them one at a time. State's Exhibit U1. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
What is that?
This would be the first DNA report I wrote for this case.
Okay. State's Exhibit U2. Not the band. Oh, kind of funny. What is that?
This would be one of the supplemental reports that I prepared for this case.
Okay. And finally, State's Exhibit U3. What is that?
This would be the third DNA analysis report I prepared for this case.
Do they all appear to be fair and accurate copies of your original reports?
Yes, they do.
Now, we have 3 reports. Can you explain to the jurors why we have 3 reports?
So the first report would be the initial request for examination that was received by our laboratory, and the other 2 are supplemental reports for additional evidence and also additional reference standards that were submitted for this case.
Now, I should ask before we get into all of the information on U1 through U3, as you were testing the property in this case, did you come up with an investigative lead for Detective Hughes?
Yes, I did.
You have access to different kinds of tools or information as you start testing that can be beneficial to detectives?
Yes.
Can that help identify potential suspects?
It can provide investigative leads, yes.
Okay. And in this case, did you notify him of a potential investigative lead?
Yes.
Did you provide a name?
Yes.
Who was that?
Anthony Pardon.
During the course of your testing, were you provided with his known standard?
Yes.
So when I say known standard, the swab from somebody's mouth.
Yes.
Okay. Were you provided standards from Rachael Anderson?
Yes.
Jonathan Kennedy?
Yes.
John Anderson?
Yes.
Somebody named Anthony Sleet?
Yes.
Bernita Anderson?
Yes.
And Deborah Pardon?
Yes.
And as a group, U1 through U3, do they contain all of your testing results?
Yes.
All right. May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm going to show you what's been marked for identification as State's Exhibits U4 through U8. If you'll take a look at those for me, please. Do you recognize those?
Yes, I do.
As a group, what are those?
They're photos that I took during the screening phase of for this case.
Do you, is that something you normally do?
Yes.
Now, to be fair, are those all of the photographs you took during the screening phase?
No.
Tell me, I guess, do you take photographs of everything?
We take photographs of items, not swabs typically, unless there's something kind of off about them, then we'll take a picture of them. Typically, it's items that we're actually swabbing for DNA or any positive stains that we find during the screening portion.
Okay. Now, you were talking about swabbing things. Do you ever swab things?
Yes.
We heard from a BCI agent who was talking about swabbing things. When you did this testing, did you use his swabs or your swabs or something else?
A combination of both.
Okay. I think, with the court's permission, it might be helpful to publish the report and go through it.
Any objection?
I'm sorry, no objection.
All right. You may.
I'm going to have it up there, and I think you have a pointer if you need it.
Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor. Okay. Okay, let's start with, just so the jury can see, State's Exhibit U1. Just very generally, what do we have up at the top here?
So that top header is just stating our laboratory name and address, and also stating that we're an accredited laboratory.
And when we see date of request, what does that mean?
So the date of request would be when we received the request from the detective.
Now, does that, we also see a suspect name here. Does that necessarily mean that that was known when it was requested?
No.
Okay. Then, if we move down, we got a whole big long list here. What are we looking at here?
So that list just contains every item that was tested for DNA.
So we see these PR numbers. What's that?
That refers to the Columbus Police property number that it's assigned when it is submitted to our property room.
So we had previously seen some property that was brought out, and if it had numbers that looked like that, that would be the property room's numbers.
Yes.
And then how about these item numbers here?
Those are our own internal laboratory numbers.
I see some that just say A1, 2, 3, 4, but then there are some that say 001 or 002. Does that tell you anything?
Those would indicate swabs that I collected during the screening portion.
So when we talked about maybe people collecting swabs in the field versus you doing the swabbing, like
Yes.
when we talked about you swabbing my jacket, will these things, these 001s or 002s, tell us what you swabbed?
They should, yes.
Okay. And then do we have more items at the top of this page?
Yes, those would just be the reference standards that were submitted.
The swabs from, like, the known DNA?
Yes.
Okay. When you say here, no analysis was performed on the remainder of the requested items, will you explain to the jury how you decide what to test, what not to test?
Most of the time, it's pretty clear on the laboratory request what is needed. However, there are times if there's a lot of evidence and we're unsure exactly where they would want us to swab an item, or if they're looking for a potential bodily fluid, we will consult with the detective and ask him or her specifically what they want done.
Do you use your training and your experience when you have those conversations?
Yes.
All right, we're still on the second page here. You had mentioned screening results, and I think you talked about that in the first, before you move on to the 4 steps. What do we see here? A presumptive chemical test for blood was positive. Can you tell us, how do you do that?
Yes, so if we see some staining on an item that is consistent with potentially being blood, we will take a small portion of that sample and use a chemical test to see if it changes color. And if it does, then that is an indication that blood may be present.
I think Agent Durst told us about it, and he used a big word. What is it?
It's tetramethylbenzidine.
Got it. Okay, so we saw in some pictures where something is swabbed, and then that TMB,
Yes.
I'm not saying the long word, is applied to it, and the swab had a blue color.
Yes.
Is that the same kind of thing you guys do?
Yes.
So now we have a list here. So when you say presumptive positive for blood, that means it turned blue.
Yes.
And then we have this list here. What do these numbers refer to?
Those numbers refer to our laboratory evidence numbers.
So these numbers here under item number?
Yes.
Okay, so we would have to match up all these numbers with this page.
Yes.
Okay, so we have a presumptive positive for blood on, can we go through these items?
Yes.
Do you need me to flip back?
So that would be the vaginal swabs,
And I think we had 002A3,
would be the oral swabs,
and then 7A1,
the inner thighs and pelvic area swabs,
11A1,
be the heating blanket cord pieces,
13A1,
be the steam iron with cut cord,
and 26A1.
serrated knife with staining.
Okay. The next part of the lab talks about male screening. What's that?
So this would be during that quantification process where we determine how much DNA that we have in a sample, and then also we can determine how much male DNA we have in a sample.
And why, well, let me ask two parts to this. Why does it matter if you have male DNA?
For specific cases, again, a lot of sexual assault cases are like this. You have a female victim and a potential male suspect.
And then why does the amount of male DNA matter?
If there is enough male DNA present and it isn't overpowered by the female, we can perform our traditional type of testing. But there are instances, again, where you just have too much female DNA, or you just have a very, very small quantity of male DNA, where YSTRs might be the better option.
Okay, so you mentioned something there about the female DNA overpowering the male DNA.
Yes.
So we might get to where you can do the, I'll call it regular DNA, STR DNA, where you look for the 23 spots.
Yes.
Or if the female's too noisy, you could move on to looking at the Y chromosome.
Yes.
Now, are there ever situations where you might have a positive for male DNA, but both of those don't work, where you just know there's male DNA, but you can't do any other testing?
Yes.
Okay, so we could have 3 different things happen there.
Potentially, yes.
Or you could have no male DNA.
That's also a possibility.
All right, so same kind of thing. Do we just match these up with the items on the other pages?
Yes.
Okay, so that's what the item number means. Under male DNA detected, this might be a dumb question, but what does the yes and the no mean?
That means whether or not we actually did detect male DNA in the sample.
Okay, and then what does suitable for DNA analysis mean?
That would just mean if it was suitable for either STR or YSTR testing.
So that would be a situation where the female DNA did not appear to be so overwhelming you couldn't do any testing.
Yes.
Now I see on some of these, so we have male DNA, yes, suitable for DNA, yes, some of them say no, but here, like on item 002A4001, it says, yes, there's male DNA, but not suitable for DNA analysis. So what does that tell us?
That would tell us that potentially the quantity was too small for us to do further testing.
Okay. So if we go through these items, this 002 series, if I remember correctly, has to do with Miss Anderson's body, right?
Yes.
So that first grouping has to do with vaginal swabs, anal swabs, oral swabs, fingernail scrapings, but actually a swab.
Yes.
Okay, and it has an 001. Did you do that swab?
Yes.
Okay, so as we go through those items, A1 being the vaginal swab, was there male DNA?
Yes.
Okay, and suitable for DNA analysis?
Yes.
Okay, and then how about, actually I'm going to use this so I don't have to keep flipping back. Is this A2 the anal swabs? Do you need me to flip back since you don't have it up there with you? The anal swabs?
Yes.
Okay, we got a no across the board.
Yes.
How about on the oral swabs?
Again, that was no for male DNA detected and no for suitable for DNA analysis.
Okay, and then this last one should be the swab from the fingernail scrapings.
Yes.
So you had male DNA underneath her fingernails or in her fingernail scrapings,
There was male DNA detected, yes.
but you couldn't determine anything else from that?
No.
Okay. And then as we go through the rest of these, I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but presumably, since they say yes, we would have some sort of further DNA analysis, whether it's the 23 spots or just the Y chromosome.
Yes.
So these should be reflected later on in your labs.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll get to them later. I do want to talk about 26A1, 001, and 002, if we can for 1 second. What are those two items?
Those would be swabs that were collected from the handle of the knife and the staining on the blade of the knife.
And just so we're clear, from the photographs I previously showed you, are we talking about, let me move it up there, States Exhibit, thank you, Your Honor, U4?
Yes,
Okay, who took this photograph?
I did.
And how do we know, this, again, sound kind of silly, how do we know that this is 26, A1, 001, and 002? Or not that it is, but that the swabs came from here?
If you move it up just a little bit, I have a header on there that actually says what the item number was and the property number.
Okay?
And then that would correspond to the item in the picture. And then I also indicated the areas on the knife where I took swabs from. So you have the handle, which is labeled 26A1001,
Okay.
and then a staining from the blade of the knife, which is labeled 026A1-002.
Okay. And that, you swabbed this yourself?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. So if we go back to this here, for both of those swabs, no male DNA, and then so no more DNA analysis. Can you explain to the jury how that might happen when you look at an item like the knife?
Yes, the knife had a lot of staining on it, so in an effort to try and avoid that, I tried to swab around those areas of staining on the handle. However, the swabs did still come up with staining on them, so it's possible it just got too much of the staining on the swabs.
And by staining, do you mean you had a presumptive positive for blood?
Yes,
So the knife appeared to have too much blood on it?
too much presumptive blood, yes.
Presumptive blood, thank you for correcting me. So I know we could see it on the blade, but are you saying when you swabbed the handle, it also came up, I forget the word you used, I apologize, some sort of, it had a discoloration or it appeared to have what was blood on it?
It appeared to have staining on it, yes.
Staining. I don't know why I couldn't remember that, I apologize. Okay, and for an item like this, was that unusual to you?
No.
Can you explain to the jury why that's not unusual to you scientifically?
Especially with an item like this, there's just so much staining on that item, it would have been impossible to completely avoid getting it up on the swabs.
Okay. We also have a sentence under here that there is no spermatozoa on 002A1 and 007A1. So the vaginal swabs and the inner thigh and pelvic area swabs. Can you explain for the jury, what does that sentence mean?
So during the extraction stage, there's a process that we can do to try to separate out potential sperm cells in the sample. And we'll take a portion of that sample and spot it onto a slide. We stain it with a couple different color dyes and look at it under the microscope. And we try to determine if we see spermatozoa in that sample.
And in this particular case, you did not.
No.
Now, when you don't see spermatozoa, does that mean that there is not going to be the potential of male DNA or your ability to determine a male DNA profile or any other beneficial testing?
No.
Okay, we have one more sentence before we get to the rest of the testing itself. DNA was extracted from these three particular items, which we'll get back to the list. However, due to the insufficient amount, this analysis was not performed. So STR analysis, what's that? Just so the jury knows.
So this would have gone through those first two stages of the process, so the extraction and the quantitation.
And is this a situation where you just see not enough, can't do anything with it?
Yes.
Okay, so to be clear, those items were 15, 17, and 19. So swab from interior front, oops, sorry, helps if I move it. Swab from interior front passenger door handle, interior rear passenger door handle, and rear driver door handle. Do I have that right?
Yes.
15, 17, 19. Okay. Now, one of those, well, let me just back up for 1 second. Presumably, at least in my car, there are people in my car. The jury heard about a perhaps smelly 14-year-old who's in the car. If you're swabbing and you're not getting enough DNA, does that mean they didn't touch the door handle?
No.
Can you explain that for us?
It could be that they didn't touch it for that long, or they don't naturally shed enough DNA to leave something behind.
All right. So is it possible for me to touch something and not leave my DNA?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just going to show you some of this language, and then I'm going to give you the labs, and we're going to go through things. So then the rest of this talks about you have profiles from items and who can be included or excluded. Do we do the same thing where we match these numbers with the front?
I'm sorry, what was
Do we do the same thing where we match these numbers here with the front list?
Yes.
Okay, so when the jury looks at these, all they have to do is take a look at that number and match it to the front.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna bring these back to you, and we're gonna go through a couple of things. May I, Your Honor? Sorry. Okay. All right, let's move through the items on U1, please. Okay, so the first item that you have listed there, that you did some testing on, I think, if I matched it up right, has to do with an empty Pepsi can.
Yes.
Okay. What, if anything, were you able to determine about that empty Pepsi can?
The DNA profile from the empty Pepsi can is consistent with an unknown male contributor.
Okay, so when you say is consistent with, what does that mean?
That means that the profile looked like a male profile.
Enough to interpret?
Yes.
Now, I'm going to ask you to turn to U3. Were you eventually able to identify who that belonged to?
I was able to make a comparison, yes.
I apologize. See, I use TV language. What were you able to determine?
The DNA profile previously obtained from the empty Pepsi can is consistent with the DNA profile of Jonathan Kennedy.
And was there anything else about that DNA? Was there anybody else's DNA there?
It was a single source profile.
What does that mean?
That means there was only one individual.
Okay. And were you able to, on U3, then eliminate other people?
Yes.
Who all did you eliminate?
It was Bernita Anderson, Deborah Pardon, and Jonathan Anderson. And then on the original lab request, or lab report, Anthony Pardon, Rachael Anderson, and Anthony Slew.
Okay. So without saying you identified it, it was consistent with Jonathan Kennedy's DNA.
Yes.
Okay, let's move to the next item on State's Exhibit U1. I believe that would be the unstained heating blanket cord pieces. Now, why do you say unstained?
There were two separate pieces of the cord. One just had a lot of staining that looked consistent with blood on it. So I avoided swabbing that because I knew I was just going to basically swab the staining. So there was another bigger piece that didn't look like it had any staining on it, so I swabbed that piece.
Okay, and you swabbed it yourself?
Yes.
And was that one of these that was presumptive positive for blood, I think?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you find out when you ran the testing on this one? And I should say, the testing we're talking about now is all of that 4-step testing, looking at the 23 spots on the DNA, right?
Yes.
Okay. What did you find out when you tested the unstained swabs? The swabs from the unstained part of the heating blanket cord. Sorry, tongue twisted.
The DNA profile is interpreted as being a mixture of 3 individuals, and Rachael Anderson cannot be excluded as the major contributor in this profile.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. If you were swabbing an item in my home, would it be unusual to see my DNA on it?
No.
So did that surprise you to see Rachael Anderson's DNA on an item from her home?
No.
Were you able to eliminate people from that?
Yes.
Who did you eliminate?
Anthony Pardid and Anthony Sleet can be excluded as the major contributor in this profile.
Now you say major, how about the rest of it? You mentioned that there appeared to be more than one person's DNA. Now, are we necessarily talking about a full profile where you could identify things?
No.
Tell me more about that.
So for this particular sample, the remainder of the mixture is not of sufficient quantity and or quality for comparison purposes. So that would mean that either there's just too little data or there's just too many contributors in that minor component to do any interpretations.
So is a result like that unusual for you when you're looking at touch DNA?
No.
Can you tell us why?
Because we're looking at such low amounts of DNA that it's more common with touch DNA samples to get mixture profiles.
That's a little bit gross. So if you have different people touching things, we have the potential to leave some of our DNA.
Yes.
But maybe not enough for you to see a profile.
Enough for us to interpret that, yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so then did you try to move on and do the YSTR testing for this one? Sorry, I'm making you flip
No, it's
pages.
fine. Yes, I did.
And did you have any luck getting additional information from that?
No, I did not.
Same issue where it wasn't either the right quality or quantity?
Yes.
And I should have asked, can that also be an issue when you do YSTR testing?
It's the same for YSTRs, yes.
Okay, so the bottom line from the unstained heating blanket cord pieces is you could identify Rachael Anderson.
Yes.
Okay, next up, and I should ask too, when you flipped to the back there, towards the end of your report, does that have the male DNA testing or that Y testing listed separately?
Yes.
But I'm combining them and making you flip around.
That's fine.
Okay, let's talk about the next item in your report, the swabs from the curling iron and the cord. Now, before you get to that, if I may, I don't know that we need the lights runner. States Exhibit U5. You had identified this for me before. Just for the jury, what are we looking at here?
This would be a photograph that I took of the curling iron and cord.
Now, on your lab report, do we know if you used your swabs or Agent Durst's?
This would be an item that I swabbed.
You swabbed it yourself?
Yes.
Do you recall how much of it you swabbed, where you swabbed?
I swabbed the entire curling iron and the entire surface of the cord.
Okay. And then that swab that you took yourself, is that what you sent on for testing?
Yes.
Or then you analyzed, I should say. You didn't just send it for testing?
Yes.
Okay, will you tell the jury what, if anything, you were able to determine when you did that?
So the DNA profile from the swabs from the curling iron and the cord is interpreted as being a mixture of 3 individuals. Rachael Anderson was assumed to be a contributor to this profile.
I'm going to stop you there. What do you mean? Because in the other one, you said she was included in the major, which you had told us you don't ever say match, you say include or exclude. Okay, so here you're using different language, assumed. What does that mean?
So in some instances, when we have a probative result that we're putting a statistic on, the type of statistics that we do, it could be helpful if we assume certain individuals that are reasonably expected to be present on an item.
What's the scientific benefit of that? I mean, why do you do that?
That would make that could potentially make the statistics more conservative to the person of interest.
So if you did, you say conservative to the person of interest. I'm going to try to interpret that.
Yeah.
So if you didn't assume her, could it make the statistic numbers artificially higher?
Yes.
So you do this in an effort to not do that?
Yes.
Okay. So you assume her in the profile, and then what do you find out?
Based on these results, it is at least 20.5 billion times more likely if the evidentiary profile originated from Rachael Anderson, Anthony Pardon, and one unknown unrelated individual than if it originated from Rachael Anderson and two unknown unrelated individuals.
I'm gonna need you to break that down for us, please. What in the world does all that mean?
So the statistic that we use is called a likelihood ratio, and so that is what statistic is being presented in this report.
So as a scientist, that number that you told us, what was it again?
It was 20.5 billion times more likely.
As a scientist, what number, not what number specifically, but on the spectrum of lower to higher numbers, what are you looking for?
Well, we're looking for a positive number that to show support for the if he is a contributor rather than if he is not a contributor.
The higher the number, the better for you?
The more likely it is.
The more likely it is. Okay, and so we had one in, I'm just gonna get it here so I don't make you say it again. One in 20.5 billion times more likely?
At least 20.5 billion times more likely.
Thank you. At least 20.5 billion times more likely that it's her and him, as in Anthony Pardon?
If it's her, Rachael Anderson, Anthony Pardon, and one unknown unrelated individual, than if it was Rachael Anderson and two unknown unrelated individuals.
Okay, so was Anthony Pardon included in this DNA?
He was included.
Okay. Those numbers confuse me sometimes. So the bottom line is,
So
as a
this-
scientist, you like the higher numbers?
Yes,
Okay. And would you consider 20.5 billion times a high number?
yes.
Okay. I can handle that. And then you said a mixture of three. Were you able to do anything with that third person or mixture information?
No.
Tell me why.
So due to the low level of data obtained from the third contributor, no further comparisons could be made to the mixture profile.
Is that the same issue where we have not great quantity or quality?
Yes.
And to be fair, if you have, let's say, one allele or one number at these 23 spots, do you have to call that a mixture?
We did in this case because it makes the profile more conservative if we're calling it a three-person.
Okay, so you could have, we're talking about 23 spots, and you have the potential to have one or two numbers at each of those 23 spots, right?
Yes.
Because you get them from your parents.
Yes.
And so if at one of those 23 spots you get one extra number that isn't Rachel's or isn't Anthony Pardon's, you have to say that's a mixture.
We would call that a three-person mixture.
Okay. Let's talk about the next item. Oh, I apologize. Going towards the end of the report, did you also then take it on to see for why STR testing?
Yes, I did.
Any luck there?
No, it was not of sufficient quantity or quality for comparison purposes.
I mean, and does that surprise you when you're talking about one allele and it already was not good quality or quantity?
For YSTRs,
I shouldn't have asked it that way. That was a bad question.
yeah,
Is it the same issue where you just didn't have the right amount or quality?
yes.
Okay. Moving on to the next item there, I believe it is the hairdryer and the cord. If I may, Your Honor.
You may.
We have State's Exhibit U6 here. What are we looking at in U6?
This would be a photograph I took of the hairdryer and cord.
Okay. And I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked for the curling iron and the cord. Did you use Agent Durst's swabs or your swabs?
I used my own swabs.
Okay. And can you tell the jury where you swabbed on the hair dryer and the cord?
I swabbed the entire item and the entire surface of the cord.
Okay. And then what results, if any, did you get when you tested those swabs that you yourself collected?
The DNA profile from the swabs, the hairdryer and cord is interpreted as being a mixture of three individuals, and Rachael Anderson was assumed to be a contributor to this profile.
So again, assumed. So you're trying to make sure you don't inflate the numbers again?
Yes.
Her item in her home, you expect her DNA?
Yes.
Okay, what's the next piece of your results there.
So based on these results, it is at least 14.5 billion times more likely if the evidentiary profile originated from Rachael Anderson, Anthony Pardon, and one unknown, unrelated individual than if it originated from Rachael Anderson and two unknown, unrelated individuals.
So I want to break that down again. Was Anthony Pardon included in that mixture?
Yes.
And another high number for you?
Yes.
Okay. Were you also able to eliminate other people from that?
Anthony Sleet can be excluded as a contributor.
And then later on, I think in U3, we'll get to you eliminating some other people. Did you then take it on for the YSTR testing?
Yes, I did.
And did you get anything from that?
It was not of sufficient quantity or quality for comparison purposes.
Okay. I want to ask you a question about that cord there. So let's say that I borrow Miss Van Kulen's hairdryer, not her curling iron, because I can't on this. All right, so her hairdryer. And, you know, I take it, I plug it in, I use it, I put it down. If you swabbed that, would you assume her in the profile?
Yes.
Her hairdryer?
Yes.
Okay, let's say that, would I have the potential of leaving touch DNA there?
Yes.
Is it always going to be enough for an interpretable profile?
No.
Is that where those factors that you talked about, the time you spend with it, things like that, environment, could impact that?
Yes.
Do things like how much you touch it impact it?
It could, yes.
Do things like how much force you're using with it impact the ability to leave touch DNA?
Potentially, yes.
Does friction impact the ability to leave touch DNA?
Yes.
So let's say that I take that same hairdryer, that's Miss Van Kulen's, and when I'm done blow drying my long, luscious hair, that I decide to be a real jerk to her, and I tie a bunch of really tight knots in it, just because I don't want her to be able to plug it in and dry her hair the right way. Whatever, I'm a jerk, okay? In that situation, does the likelihood of me leaving more touch DNA or you getting an interpretable DNA profile increase, decrease, or something else?
I would expect it to increase.
And why?
Because there's more opportunity for you to leave DNA behind. You're handling it longer. You're actually physically manipulating the cord.
And those are those kind of factors that could impact the amount of touch DNA you leave behind.
Yes.
Okay. Would you like me to continue, Your Honor, or would you like to take a break?
This may be a good time to take a break.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and take our morning break, ladies and gentlemen. I need you back in the jury room, let's say in about 20 minutes, so about 5 till. Okay, again, remember the admonitions that I've given you with respect to discussing this case among yourselves or with anyone else. All rise for the jury. All right, see everyone back in about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
You can get a spread if you'd like.
Oh, you can come down, Lynndsey.